Dear students, after studying this module, you shall be able to learn about the basic brain structures involved in the process of attention and perception, learn about various psychological and neurological models of the process of attention, identify various techniques used to study attention and perception, learn about approaches to study pattern recognition, and understand how culture affects the attention and perception processes. The term attention refers to a general level of alertness or vigilance, a general state of arousal, orientation to stimuli, the ability to focus, divide or sustain mental effort, the ability to target processing within a specific sensory arena such as visual attention or auditory attention, or a measure of capacity. Attention processing is a multifaceted concept. It implies involvement of multiple behavioral states and cortical processes that various subsets of cerebral structures control. Brain's efficiency to process information diminishes and declines in many types of brain dysfunctions. In case of attention deficit, one is not able to sustain attention to one particular stimulus for a longer duration or is not able to attend to a specific stimulus out of many competing stimuli. If this impairment is profound, it is easily noticed by others, but if it is minimally present, it can only be detected through neuropsychological testing. Attention has always been seen as a general and non-specific factor affecting performance. There is evidence from the neuroscience now that attention system has separate subsystems performing functions that are separate but interrelated. And these subsystems also interact with other domain-specific systems. Reticular activating system plays a crucial role in the processing of attention. The reticular activating system plays a vital role not only cortical arousal but also in subcortical and limbic arousal. Major brain structures involved in the process of attention. The attention process involves arousal or activation, which is controlled by the reticular activating system. RAS, with its origin in the midbrain, plays a vital role in projecting to large areas of the cortex and hence regulates the activation of cortical areas in the attention processing. This arousal can be observed and categorized into certain brain wave types, namely beta, alpha, theta and delta. These brain waves are categorized based on their frequency and are measured by electroencephalograph (EEG), and the pattern that is produced by EEG is called electroencephalogram. Sensory input provides a much needed change to the reticular activating system, which is then followed by further processing in the brainstem and other areas which maintain a high cortical activation. However, it should also be noted that lack of sensory input does not lead to inactivation or drowsiness. In fact, when the sensory input is constantly present, the brain adapts itself to its constant presence or habituates itself. If there is loud music playing in our vicinity, then after some time we get habituated to that loud noise. Reticular activating system not only plays an important role in cortical activation but also in anticipatory responding, which means that reticular activating system prepares the cortex to receive stimuli by keeping it in a heightened state of readiness. Apart from reticular activating system, there are other subcortical structures that have been identified by neuroscientists to be playing a vital role in the process of attention. For example, support of sustained attention is ascribed to the right frontoparietal thalamic neural network. The thalamus, basal ganglia, and superior and inferior colliculi play a supporting role in the selective visual attention. Visual attention as a process involves the orienting reflex in terms of both eye movements and head movements towards the visual stimuli. It has been found that the superior colliculi is implicated in visual attention, while the inferior colliculi plays a role when orienting to auditory reflex. The higher level of attention processing that is controlled by cerebrum can be characterized as focused attention, ability to alternate attention, divided attention, and sustained attention. Focused attention is the ability to respond and pick up the important elements of figure of attention from the ground or background of external and internal stimulation. When there is a need to attend to more than one stimulus, it requires the ability to alternate attention. For example, the food joint owner who cooks as well as takes orders has to alternate his attention between the two tasks where he has to switch back and forth between cooking and taking orders. Divided attention consists of partialing out of attention resources at the same time rather than switching back and forth. Performing tasks of driving a car, listening to music and talking to a passenger is an example of divided attention. Sustained attention is the ability to maintain an effortless response over time. It is related to the ability to persist and sustain a level of vigilance. Attention can also be described on the basis of tasks that we are engaging in and the level of information processing demands posed by the task. Tasks might be familiar or unfamiliar. If the task is familiar or routine, which does not involve much of the conscious thinking, it can be performed more or less automatically. It does not need additional allocation of resources to be performed, unlike tasks that are unfamiliar. Models of attention. In order to understand the attention processes, various models have been proposed. These models can be categorized into A. Psychological models of attention and B. Neurological models of attention. Psychological models of attention. These models are divided into filter models and limited capacity models. Filter models address the selective nature of attention. These postulate a bottleneck in the flow of information from initial sensory processing to the registration in conscious awareness. According to these models, there is a structural bottleneck that limits the information that we attend to. These models are mainly concerned with how some information gets selected for information processing and the rest gets discarded. Some of such models are as such: Broadbent's filter model or the early selection model. Broadbent in 1958 developed a filter model of selective attention. According to this model, any incoming information before being processed semantically passes through a filter. If the message does not have right physical characteristics, then the message is cut out by the filter. For example, if there are different information being received by both the ears, and if we are concentrating on the information being received by the right ear, then the information coming in from left ear would be filtered out, which means that it would not be processed further for meaning because it lacked the appropriate physical characteristics. This model is based on Cherry's 1953 dichotic listening task and Broadbent's 1958 split span task. Cherry presented the participants with two entirely different messages using headphones. One earphone carried a different message from the other earphone, and both messages were presented at the same time. The participant had to shadow the message coming from one ear by speaking it aloud. This was helpful for the researcher to gauge what message the participants were attending to at any one time. In Broadbent's split span study also, the participants were presented with two different types of information using headphones, but the information presented was pairs of digit letters or numbers presented simultaneously. They simply had to repeat what they heard. Cherry found that the participants were completely unaware of the information presented to the ear they were not attending to, except a few general physical characteristics. Broadbent found that when participants were asked to recall the digits that they had heard, they would invariably recall the pair of digits presented to one ear only. It led to the conclusion that the messages were selected and attended to based on their physical characteristics over other messages, and the information that people attend to only gets processed and other information gets filtered. According to this model, because the selection of information occurs early and information from only one input receives attention and is perceived, it is called early selection model. The theory places the bottleneck immediately after the sensory memory. Broadbent faced a lot of criticism. The most important one came from Murray, who found that in dichotic listening tasks, participants could pick up bits of information which were personally important to them, even if they were not attending to this information. For example, their name. This finding then led to cocktail party phenomena, which maintained that even in a situation like a cocktail party, where a lot of conversation go on to the same time, for most of the time people were engrossed in their own conversations in small groups. If someone spoke their name in the party, they were able to hear it and attend to it even when they were engrossed in their own conversations. Next, Trestman attenuation model. Trestman proposed an alternative model. She proposed that information from one channel receives attention, but information from other channels is not completely blocked. In fact, that information is attenuated or turned down in intensity. This model also places the bottleneck after sensory registration, but it assumed that the filter merely lessened or attenuated the signal strength of the unattended material. Trestman further proposed that after being attenuated, the message would go through a second stage analyzer, which would semantically process the information by triggering off dictionary units that analyzed words or concepts. In the second stage analyzer, less important concepts and words would have higher threshold of response, and the dictionary unit would trigger off only when the less important concept becomes strong in some other way, for example by being louder. The pertinence model or the late selection model. Another model was put forward by Dush and later revised by Norman in 1976. According to them, there is no need for an attenuating filter and a second stage analyzer to process the information. They proposed a model based on second selection process, one that is based on semantic characteristics. This model had a filter, but the role of it comes much later in the process, unlike the other two models explained above. The first stage of processing in this model is the same as those of the other models. Information from the sensory store is filtered on the basis of physical characteristics and then recognized. However, before being passed into the short-term memory, it goes through the secondary selection mechanism. This mechanism then selects the information on the basis of semantic characteristics or the message content. Therefore, in this model, all the incoming information is first processed semantically, and after the information is processed semantically, pertinent information is attended to and irrelevant information is filtered out. Because the selection of the pertinent information happens late in the model, it also is called the late selection model. Limited capacity models of attention describe the allocation of resources to specific mental processes. Capacity models recognize that one or more bottleneck exists, but added that the mental processes compete for limited resources as well. These models vary from a pool of undifferentiated general resources to specific resources for sensory, central, and response processing. Processing has also been differentiated as automatic or controlled, where controlled processing requires greater attention resources. Automatic processing, on the other hand, occurs without attention control, even if the individual tends to stop, that is, it operates without conscious awareness. Norman and Bobrow put forward an alternative to filter models, arguing that humans have a limited capacity for attention, and this is the reason why we as human beings are able to attend to only some information and the rest gets lost. It is difficult to divide our attention because our attention resources available at our disposal are limited, and allocation of these resources is based on situational demands. Some tasks can be difficult to attend because we are limited by the data, that is, information available is not good enough for our selective attention processes to pick up. While other tasks are resource limited, that is, in order to do them successfully, we have to devote a lot of attention resources as they are complicated. Further, Norman and Bobrow suggest that there is an upper limit to our attention capacities, and we can do things successfully only when we stay within these limits. For example, if we are walking and talking on the phone simultaneously, both tasks continue till they stay within their upper limits, but as soon as a hurdle like crossing a road, jumping a pothole comes about, we cease to talk as the upper limit of the task of walking has demanded more of our attention and the other demands needs to be reduced. Kahneman also proposed that we have only a limited capacity for attention. According to Kahneman, every task needs allocation of attention resources for successful execution of the task, and this allocation of resources is done by the central processor. He further explains that this allocation of resources by the central processor depends on the number of demands being made and the physical state of being. The allocation of resources therefore depends on whether the number of demands on the processor is high or low. If one is feeling physically drained or weak, it will obviously affect the allocation of resources, as physical energy directly affects mental energy. Same is true for the person feeling physically healthy, which boosts mental energy, and hence allocation of resources increase. There are three main factors affecting the allocation of resources by the central processor. The first one, one's capacity, which relates to the kind of mental effort the task under consideration would involve. 2. Enduring disposition, such as personality, habits, etc. And 3. Momentary intentions, moods, context, etc. Neurological models of attention. Muslim's model of spatial attention. Muslim model mainly focuses on spatial and selective attention. According to his model, posterior parietal cortex, frontal cortex, and the cingulate cortex play a significant role in spatial attention to the extrapersonal world. Muslim explained that the parietal cortex generates an internal spatial representation or the sensory map of the extrapersonal world, whereas motivational and emotional significance to these elements is assigned and regulated by the cingulate cortex. The frontal cortex, particularly the frontal eye field and surrounding areas, modulates and coordinates motor programs for exploration, scanning, fixating, and manipulating extrapersonal stimuli. This model thus proposed that spatial attention is not only dependent on a specific brain area. It rather depends on the integration of other brain areas along with subcortical structures such as thalamus and stratum, which leads to selective or spatial attention. Now, some of the functions and its neural correlates are as follows. Sensory representation, the neural correlate is posterior parietal cortex. Motivational importance and expectancy, its neural correlate is cingulate cortex. Motor response, its neural correlate is frontal cortex. Posner's anterior and posterior attention model. Michel Posner model came with both a cognitive and a neuroscience flavor. This model defined attention in terms of three major functions: orienting to events, vigilance, and executive functions. For each of these functions involved in attention, there is a separate neural network, and these neural networks do not work in isolation but interact with each other and other cortical and subcortical regions to carry out the attention process. The first major function that Posner's model described is orienting to events, particularly to location in visual space. Visual orienting in event consists of three cognitive operations: disengage, move, and engage. So in visual orientation, these three cognitive operations get activated. This means that whenever we are orienting ourselves to a visual stimulus in the environment, we first disengage from the prior one, then move our focus to the current event, and then engage our attention resources on the current event. The cognitive operation of disengagement is linked with the parietal region, move with the midbrain, and engagement with the thalamic region, and therefore the visual orienting system is called the posterior attention system. The posterior parietal lobe mediates conscious attention to spatial targets. The midbrain superior colliculus plays a role in moving the eye from one position to another, and the pulvinar of the thalamus helps select the filter important sensory information. The neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is produced by the nucleus basalis of the forebrain, has also been suggested to be modulating the orienting system. The second important function is achieving and maintaining a vigilant or alert state. There are times when we need to maintain a higher level of alertness in order to process a high priority target. There has to be higher level of arousal sustained in this attention process. For example, if amongst many faces in a party, we have to find a specific face, we would look around and maintain a high level of alertness without getting distracted by the music or noise in the background. Here, music or noise becomes the irrelevant information. The irrelevant information might be either external, like the background music, or noise, or internal, like hunger, which means that even when one is feeling hungry, one will ignore that internal state of hunger while searching for that one face amongst many in the party. In making one vigilant or carrying out the process of vigilance, right frontal and parietal regions of the brain play the most important role along with the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, that also helps in achieving the state of sustained attention or vigilance. The third major function that Posner's model defines is of orchestrating voluntary actions or carrying out the executive functions. The anterior or executive control system is mostly involved in regulating and coordinating between the brain regions carrying out the voluntary attention processes by organizing or taking charge of high-order cognitive functions such as conflict resolution, inhibitory control, task switching, error detection, etc. Posner's focus on the anterior cingulate and lateral prefrontal cortex as major areas involved in the executive attention, elaborating on the functions of the two brain areas implicated in the executive functioning of attention. The lateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulated get jointly activated, where lateral prefrontal helps in performing an internal representation of the information in temporary memory, while anterior cingulate provides top-down inhibitory control by resolving the conflict between the possible responses and therefore helps in response. The neurotransmitter dopamine is considered as the primary neural modulator of the executive or anterior attention system. We are going to look at the attention networks, its functions, the brain regions associated and the neurotransmitters implicated. So posterior orienting system, the function is orienting to stimuli or disengage. The brain regions are temporal and the neurotransmitter implicated is acetylcholine. For attention from a stimuli, the brain region is parietal, superior, temporal or superior parietal lobes. For vigilance attention system, the functions are achieving and maintaining in alert state. The brain regions involved are right frontoparietal and the neurotransmitter implicated is norepinephrine. The attention network is anterior or executive attention system. The function is orchestrating voluntary actions. The part of the brain regions responsible for it is anterior cingulate, lateral prefrontal cortex, and the neurotransmitter implicated is dopamine. Mirsky elements of attention model. Mirsky identified and proposed elements of attention and suggested that these elements of attention relate to the underlying neural system. According to him, three elements of attention are focus, execute, sustain, and shift. Mirsky also related these elements to neuropsychological measures and thus compiled a battery of the measures that are sensitive to attentional functioning. In order to reaffirm if there are only these three elements of attention, Mirsky administered this battery of tests to neuropsychiatric patients and then also extended it to healthy children. The battery of tests for focus execute included Weiss revised, digit symbol, Stroop test, letter cancellation and trail making test part A and B for adults and Whisk revised, coding and digit cancellation for children. For shift and sustain, Wisconsin card sorting and continuous performance tests were used respectively for both adults and children. To test encoding, Weiss revised was used for adults and Whisk-R was used for children. In both the studies, 4 factors were identified, of which 3 coincided with the earlier elements and 4th one was also added to the list. Focus execute attention involves selective attention and rapid perceptual motor output. Shifting attention is the ability to move or change attentional focus in a flexible and adaptive manner. Sustained attention pertains to the attention function of vigilance. Encode attention is the capacity to briefly maintain information in memory while performing other related actions. Now the factors and the neural correlates are given below. So for factors focus execute, the neural correlates are focus, inferior parietal and superior temporal cortexes. For execute, it's inferior parietal and corpus stratum. For shift, prefrontal cortex. For sustain, rostral midbrain structures and brainstem. And for encode, hippocampus and amygdala. Techniques to measure the process of attention. As given by Perry and Hoggs, in order to measure attention, 4 neuropsychological tools have been used. 1. Conventional neuropsychological tests. 2. Computer-based information. 3. Functional imaging. And 4. Cognitive event-related potentials. Conventional neuropsychological tests are the most popular for evaluation attention because their norms are well established and therefore they have standardized versions available, which makes it easy to compare the scores across studies. Also, conventional neuropsychological tests are easy to administer as most of them are based on traditional paper pen approach. But along with being advantageous in terms of being easily administrable, these tests also have drawbacks. These tests have poor temporal resolution and lack of specificity. Computer-based neuropsychological tests or information processing tasks are investigations that make use of computer tests. The advantages of these tests are that because they are computer-based, the results are accurate and reproducible. They use technology in the investigation of attention also makes these tests accurate in terms of time of administration. It is only that a very few standardized versions of these tests are available and therefore it is difficult to compare scores across studies. An exception to this, Cambridge Neuropsychological Test Automated Battery, which is used widely and has norms available. Functional imaging techniques like positron emission tomography (PET), single photon emission computed tomography (SPECT), and functional MRI is some of the most widely used imaging techniques for evaluating attention. These techniques provide good spatial resolution but poor temporal resolution. Cognitive event-related potential is a neuropsychological technique in which electrophysiological responses related to an internal cognitive event are measured through scalp recorders. So, recorders are placed on the scalp, and while the participant is performing the activity which he or she has been asked to perform, the internal cognitive events gets recorded. According to Perry and Hoggs, cognitive ERPs have good temporal resolution and are able to differentiate between sensory, cognitive, and response processing. Some drawbacks of this kind of an investigative tool is its poor spatial resolution and little application to date. Neural correlates of perception. The relationship between psychophysics and neuropsychology is best explained by signal detection theory. Contrast detection tasks illustrate the relationship between psychophysics and neurophysiology. Heger and Rees conducted contrast detection tasks in which on each trial subjects were presented with one of the two stimuli, either a background presented alone or the same background with low contrast target pattern superimposition. There was a button that participants had to press when they saw the target or when they believed the target was absent. Based on the above design, there were 4 possible outcomes: hits, when target is there and participants correctly recognize it; correct rejections, when participants recognize the target is absent; false alarms, when participant perceives the target to be present while it is not; and misses when participants are not able to correctly perceive the presence of target. Heger and Rees found that there was an increased cortical activity on hits and false alarms than correct rejections and misses. Other researchers have shown that there exists a difference in neuronal activity on trials in which the target is present versus trials in which the target is absent, suggesting that there is a slightly greater neuronal activity in target present stimulus trials than in target absent stimulus trials. But however, it has also been shown that neural responses are variable from one trial to next. So based on the above research findings, it can be concluded that there exists a corresponding change in neural activity in each of the four possible responses. Pattern recognition or top-down and bottom-up approach. The identification of objects and events is called pattern recognition. It forms part of perception. Various approaches have been used to explain pattern recognition. One of the most important approaches to pattern recognition is the top-down bottom-up approach. Top-down approach is conceptually driven pattern recognition, which refers to the use of expectations to ease the process of finding a match between the incoming stimuli and the schemas that store information about the world in the long-term memory. Thus, in top-down processing, recognition of whole leads to the recognition of component parts, and we bring what we know and what we expect in surrounding context for determining what we are sensing and subsequently processing. Top-down approach involves application of concepts to perception, and therefore it is also called as conceptually driven processing. Bottom-up or the data-driven pattern recognition refers to the use of features picked up from the environment. Recognition is initiated by the parts of the pattern that when summed up lead to the recognition of the whole pattern. Top-down mechanism is related to endogenous attention as activation in the frontoparietal regions of the brain can be seen during both. So, it can be said that endogenous attention takes place via top-down approach. For exogenous attention, Pessoa and Unger conducted a study to investigate neural correlates of exogenous attentional mechanism by comparing brain activations on correct change versus correct no change trials. This means that participants had to detect if there was a change taking place in their periphery in the experimental situation. If there was a change, they detect it rightly, was compared if there was no change and they detect it right. Based on the study, it was found that the change detection activates frontal and parietal regions via bottom-up mechanisms located in these regions, which then function via top-down mechanism to deploy attention to the location of a change. Subcortical structures like pulvinar were also involved in the deployment of attention. Cultural influence on neural correlates of perception. With increased research in the area of social cognition, it becomes important to discuss the role of culture and its influence, if any, on neural substrates of attentional control. Research on social cognition postulates two kinds of cultural contexts: interdependent, like the East Asian cultures in China, Japan and Korea, and independent, like Europe, North America, etc. It is believed that people from interdependent cultures are able to perform better on tasks that involve relative, such as context-dependent or interdependent demands, while people from independent culture are able to perform better on tasks with absolute or independent demands. People from Western cultural contexts perform better on tasks with independent demands than on tasks with interdependent demands. These findings suggest that cultural influences the process of perception in a fundamental way. Hayden et al. Carried out a study to find out if the brain cultural experience influences the perceptual processes in conditions involving independent versus interdependent judgments using functional resonance imaging. They compared cultural groups while they engaged in culturally preferred and non-preferred tasks. Their findings suggest that cultural differences influence brain function significantly. Through their study, it was also found that culturally influenced activation differences were most prominently found in the frontal and the parietal regions of the brain. Summary: the term attention refers to a general level of alertness or vigilance, a general state of arousal. The attention process involves arousal or activation, which is controlled by reticular activating system. Psychological models to explain the process of attention include Brodmann's model of selective attention, Trisman's model by Dush and the Pertinence model, which is also known as the late selection model. Neurological models of attention include Muslim's model of spatial attention, frontoparietal regions of the brain, and subcortical structures like pulvinar are the neural structures supporting attentional processes.